Okay, here we go. Good morning. So we're ready to go. As I mentioned before, and some of you have already gone online, as I record these, because we have a couple folks that are doing remote this semester, then I convert them and put them up on my YouTube page. I'll send you an email when they're posted. So you're more than welcome to go back and review those as we go through. And again, as I mentioned, you know, the purpose of my PowerPoint should be triggers for you when you go back and do your studies for exams. I'll be uploading the new syllabi. The only difference this time is it has the tentative calendar that shows the estimated exam dates. We decided last time we'd do 4 exams. So I basically got 2 before spring or fall break and 2 after. 1 after is a regular one, and then the 4th will be the final exam, which will be done remotely on Wolf Den. Because as I said before, our last day of class will be on the 23rd of November, which is that Tuesday before Thanksgiving. All the calendar shows coming back on the 30th. What you'll have to do is your critical review essay. You just email that to me that day. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't do it in advance. Just email it. Just as long as I get an email from you that day, that'll count as being present for that last day of class. And then we'll do the final exam. They'll all be in the same format. As we said, they are not cumulative, so we'll be covering each section as we go through. Okay, so on Thursday we'll finish reading, discussing Chapter 1, which is history, begin in Chapter 2, and move on to our discussion from there. All of you got the email I sent out yesterday about talking about, okay, because that's what we're going to spend a bit of time talking about. A couple pictures I thought was interesting is, first is how quickly it blew up into from nothing to a lot of things going on, which I thought was interesting. I lived in New Orleans for several years, and so this is evacuation. These are all things we're going to spend a bit of time talking about, which I thought was interesting. Found that picture today that nobody's safe from the water. When it comes up, we go on from there. This is the beginning of recovery effort. Moving forward, and the track, projected track, which means, as we know, hurricanes get powerful, and as soon as they get over land, they start to break down. But this will be a weather maker throughout the year where it travels, and they even have, I think, alert days posted for us this evening and tomorrow for possible rain and whatnot. So I was through 2 minor hurricanes when I lived in New Orleans. Any of you been through a hurricane? Yes? Was it fun?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Florida, we go through a lot of them.
Yeah.
I kind of enjoy it. We never leave. We only leave if it's like a Camp 4 or 5. If it's a Camp 3, we just stay.
Oh, okay. So it's like me only buying lottery tickets when it's over like $20 million, because other than that, it's chump change.
Yeah, literally.
Why don't you leave?
I mean, because most of the time, by the time it like gets to us, like it's not as bad. Like we got hit with Irma, I would say, in Matthew, and like our damage wasn't severe. They kept telling us it was gonna hit us dead on, and it didn't. And then I think the only hurricane that we actually got hit with badly was Jean or Charlie, and that was just like some trees came down on the house and stuff like that. But, like,
Lose power and that kind of thing?
Yeah, we always lose power and the water goes out for a couple of days, but I mean, it's nothing.
You have a generator or anything up? Okay, so you hook up the generator and you rock and roll from there.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, and what was your experience like going through a hurricane?
Pretty much the same. I mean, we never got really any strong hurricanes really, so we just kind of sit there. Like we never evacuated either, just because I think the strongest one was a Category 3, and it like barely jumped into it right before it hit us. So.
Yeah, that's always one of the interesting things is a number of people who decide not to evacuate. Does that happen in New Orleans with Hurricane Ida? Yeah, what'd you hear about them?
The people that stayed at one point, it was like really early into it, because of the flooding, they just suspended all the EMS. So it's like you're kind of on your own.
Yeah.
Someone stayed that was in Hurricane Katrina.
Pardon me?
Had somebody that stayed that could also go through Hurricane Katrina, and said that it was just as terrifying for them, if not more.
Okay. Also, we've heard about people who decided not to leave.
They died. One died, didn't they?
Well, Well, they've only got one death, but I haven't heard whether it was, directly related because it didn't evacuate or whether it was somehow else related. One of the other things is that, there are reports, and they had 911 calls of people being forced up into their attic. Grand Isle, which is underwater most of the time anyway, south of New Orleans. It's a bit of a challenge. So it's interesting why people choose, and in some ways it even relates to what we're dealing with today with COVID-19 vaccines. We just had a guy I went to church with who said, nah, it's a hoax, it's a scam, his funeral's tomorrow. And his last wish before they put him on the respirator was, tell everybody to get their shots. Nobody wants to go through this. But yet still people, for a variety of reasons, their own, decide not to do that. And so it's the same with evacuation. Oh, it's not going to be as bad, or I evacuated once before and it wasn't horrible, or we never did anything strong around here. I mean, there are a lot of reasons we go through our own minds we choose not to do things, right? And again, there's no right or wrong, but specifically in a lot of cases, we have to understand that our decision to not follow advice puts other people at risk. There was an interview with the Coast Guard about having to get out with their helicopters and wait till the wind got somewhat manageable. If you've seen helicopters flying in bad weather, it's not a fun thing to do, but you're putting those other people at risk in the process. And so there's always a balance that you have to consider when you're planning these things, is that there are people who are not going to follow mandatory evacuation. And then how do you deal with that? What risk should I take to save somebody who refused to follow advice? Now, obviously, first responders have a different mindset than people like me, which is a good thing, right? Be gentle. I'm very sensitive here. So, but I mean, it's if you choose not to do it, why should that be my problem? But yet, first responders put their lives at risk to save those situations. And we also understand what are some other reasons people don't evacuate. There were several reports of why people didn't evacuate.
Pets.
Pardon me?
Pets.
Pets. Yep. Yep. It's amazing the number of people get in car wrecks swerving to avoid an animal in the road.
I don't.
Huh? You just smack them. Well, you're from Florida. It's expected, right? But what are some of the reasons people gave for not evacuating?
I guess because some people have been through worse.
They've been through worse, so they decided not to do it.
Some people, they don't like to leave their homes. I know my grandmother, she does not want to leave her home, but we have to let go so that we.
Yeah, I mean, that's home. It's been there. She survived all this other kind of stuff. I'm not going to leave it to allow just chance to take over. Absolutely. What's another reason that people don't evacuate?
They can't.
Pardon me?
They physically can't.
They're physically unable. So they have to rely on EMS or friends to get them out of the house. And so that's a bit of a challenge. And you saw several of that with people in wheelchairs being carried out and stuff like that. Okay.
Again, sometimes it just happens. I guess some things aren't expected. Maybe not like a hurricane either was expected, but there are some things that happen that weren't expected.
Give me an example.
National emergency, I guess.
One of them
COVID,
starts.
like COVID. Like we knew it was in China, but when it came over here, no one really expected it to come here.
Well, yeah, that's an issue of debate, yeah. But there's a great example of how it's tough to evacuate, and it starts with an E.
Elderly.
No, well, that could be too. But EA, do this hangman thing. GH, earthquakes. Yeah, I went through 2 of them in Southern California. It's the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. You're laying there in bed, and all of a sudden the whole room starts shaking, and books start falling off the bookcase. We haven't gotten the technology sufficient yet. We can, predict those things. So yeah, just some things unexpected happen. You're absolutely right. Okay, but we talked about a good thing: elderly, the infirmed, people have pets, people don't want to leave their homes. But there's also the big one that starts with T, followed by R. Transportation. Good job. Yeah. I love this. Oh, this could also be what? What's the other show that you do letters?
Family Feud.
Family Feud?
Just kidding. Wheel of Fortune.
Wheel of Fortune? Yeah, we could do. Okay, well, this would be Wheel of Fortune rather than a hangman. That's more contemporary. that whole idea of transportation. Some people don't have transportation, don't have reliable transportation. So a lot of legitimate reasons that people cannot or will not evacuate, rather than just, I don't believe it, I'm not going to go along with it. And so when you're doing emergency preparedness, you have to deal with those kinds of issues to go through. Yes, sir.
Will it like state or county use like transportation buses or anything like that to transfer people out? Or like,
Okay. What happened 16 years ago yesterday?
Hurricane Katrina.
Hurricane Katrina. It was amazing, 16 years to the day. And that's an example where they used public transportation, buses, school buses, whatever they could find to evacuate those folks that didn't have transportation. So there are those examples. And that goes back to something we talked about in the video, which when you get into the history part and move forward, this whole issue of collaboration, of finding partners. Were there any examples you may have seen about how that's happening in Ida right now?
FEMA doesn't really say much on their website.
Okay, there's several news reports. I mean, two of the big volunteer organizations that responded almost immediately with water rescues. Cajun Navy was one, and then there's another group called Team Rubicon, which is basically veterans. And they coordinate, and what is interesting there is back to the video, is they have one of their members at the emergency preparedness headquarters to coordinate activities. So that idea is we don't want to duplicate efforts, we don't want to go if there are other people already working the area. So that idea of collaboration, coordination is done beforehand. So in addition to the government, to FEMA getting involved and Coast Guard and bringing in National Guard and things like that, there are also completely volunteer efforts such as, again, Team Rubicon and Cajun Navy, who also coordinate with. It gets to be an important element to go with that. What else do we know about Hurricane Ida?
I know a man got attacked by an alligator in the floodwaters and they've yet to find his body.
Man got attacked by an alligator, but they haven't found his body. So this was witnessed by people.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
witnessed by his wife. She saw the gator grab hold of his arm, and then next thing you know, he was getting gator rolled, and they haven't found him.
And that's one of the challenges when you got a lot of rushing water. I remember one of the stories from Hurricane Hugo is a friend of mine was talking about going back to the house and being dead fish in the living room. Because with that storm surge and whatnot, there's no telling what gets pushed up and pushed in to move forward from there. This is next one. Have any of you been to New Orleans, spent any time in New Orleans? Okay, just what's some of your reactions or observations from being in New Orleans?
It's very, very congested, very, to me, I find it kind of confusing to navigate. A lot of it is very low in terms of their surface level. So you're looking for like a specific.
Yeah, I mean, things that relate directly to the increased impact of hurricanes. I thought you were on the path there, you talked about low. Most of New Orleans is below sea level. So immediately you've got that pool effect of going in. New Orleans is one of the strange places where the sun rises over the west bank of the Mississippi. It's called a crescent city, so if you see the way the river goes through, the way it bends around, when you're downtown New Orleans, it's actually the west bank where the sun comes up. But the other thing that's critical is the whole idea of the levee systems. Did you, when you were traveling around, see any of the floodgates they had installed and the levee system they had throughout the city?
Pretty sure I did.
Yeah. But one of the challenges, because it's below sea level, anytime it rains, if it's more than an inch of rain, it floods. So they have huge pumping stations that pump water out of the system into Lake Pontchartrain to try to, dry out the city as best they can. One of the things that a couple of problems they had during Hurricane Katrina was one, people would dump their trash and bicycles and shopping carts into the levees. So when they turned on the pumps, guess what happened? They clogged, right? So that made it. They also had studies done 20 years before, 10 years at least before Katrina went through, that the levee system wasn't adequate. and a lot of levees breached. The flood, wall, the levee system and the seawalls they had put in that had gates and stuff, a lot of those are overtopped by the water. And it became basically a big bowl of stuff that was hard to get rid of. And so this is a thing that I saw recently where you see the highlighted, they've spent roughly $14 billion in the last 16 years reinforcing the floodgates and the levee system to be able to stand a 15-foot tidal surge.
Didn't it help a lot though?
Well, that's a good question.
Because I read that it did. I don't know if it was true or not.
Well, no, why don't you know if it's true or not?
Because different sources have different information. Either way, they were super flooded. But
Well, the reality is New Orleans didn't get all the flooding that they anticipated because the levee system and the seawalls, in fact, stood up to what they were supposed to do. The problem was it wasn't the same as Hurricane Katrina in the way it attacked and approached.
yeah.
So was this really a good test? So it's kind of like you get a flu. How many of you get a flu shot every year? Right? Does that mean you won't get the flu? No, because what they do is they estimate what's the most likely variants to come through and get the vaccine to address those that they think are the most common flu viruses, flu elements will come through. And if you get that one, it works fine. So if you don't get the flu, it doesn't necessarily mean the flu shot worked. It may mean that, the strain. So the levee system is the same way. And so the good news is it protected. And so this just shows you some massive amount. There's, you see the crescent of the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, St. Bernard Parish, the lower ninth quarter, Chalmette, that area that flooded. And why is Chalmette important from a history point of view? 1814 took a little trip down the Mississippi to New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans. It was
Oh, the Battle of New Orleans, yeah.
the American forces were in Chalmette, and one of the things that happened. Any of you got history buffs in here? No, fascinating stuff. Anyway, when they had particularly dry period, a lot of the fortifications that were used for the bombardment became visible, and they had to change their thinking of the way the attack on New Orleans went. Just like what happened with the Battle of Little Bighorn. What's that?
With the Indians?
Yes.
That's about all I had.
Or Custer.
Custer.
Oh, Custard's Last Stand.
Well, they had all these stories and images and whatnot, and they had a big fire, a prairie fire went through, and when they went back to recover after the fire, they found all the places where there were massive shell casings and stuff like that. So they had to rethink. Well, and this will tie in, because I'm the master of segues, it'll tie into why we study history moving forward. So the levee system is just massive down there. And again, they expected. And you see it's a big bowl. You've got the river, then you've got all of the marsh areas, you've got Lake Pontchartrain. And so there's a whole bunch going on there. So the good news is that the seawalls worked this time. And whether it was because of the strength of them or because the hurricane wasn't the same, the reality is it kept New Orleans out of flooding. There's a place just west of New Orleans called La Place, and they got nailed big time. And they're a small, relatively rural area. It's across the causeway on Interstate 10 getting into New Orleans, and the pictures coming out of this devastation. And again, that has to do with several things. One is, who's more likely to get money to fix up damage after a major disaster? Big places or little places? Big places. And a lot of that's because they get the most publicity, right? They have the most political power to move through. And so one of the challenges in this issue of emergencies is how do we then provide resources available to local governments to do that? You saw an influx of that kind of effort after 9/11 because there was a lot of money gone in to kind of do preemptive measures. So you saw bulletproof glass and all these other kind of things put in buildings. So what was your sense of the preparation that was put in for this? Did you follow anything on the news about how well prepared they were for it?
I'd say like they were pretty prepared, but I remember the one thing that stood out to me was like the day before it hit, they're like, there's not enough time to evacuate everybody, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the pictures you saw. I mean, there's not a whole lot of ways in and out of New Orleans. You got Interstate 10, which goes across Lake Pontchartrain by Slidell and then heads up toward Baton Rouge. You can take the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge to get you over to Mandeville and those places across. And then there's Highway 90, but that's right along the coast. So taking Highway 90 won't get you away from anything. And so you saw the pictures, and that's one of the toughies. I mean, how soon in advance, and what do they do in South Carolina when we have mass evacuation from the coast?
It's pretty much the same thing, but they kind of do it, like McMaster's done it pretty early every time.
Pretty early. Well, what's the major thing they do with the interstates?
They flip them.
Yeah, they reverse lanes. And so going away from the hurricane, they open the lanes on the opposite side. And if you're going south, you're crazy, but you take side roads and whatnot to get by and do those things. So there's certain things we can do, but what did we see? I mean, how much, the large percentage of our population is in coastal areas. The growth that's taking place in Charleston after Hugo is just significant. So all those more people in Savannah, all those areas have grown. Did the hurricane match the projections?
No, it didn't grow or something like
Pardon me?
that. It get stronger.
Well, yeah, they predicted it would come ashore as a Category 4, and the news that I saw was the largest recorded gust was 172 miles an hour. So they predicted rapid growth once it got into the Gulf of Mexico. So they were predicting a level 4. And then the path, again, so if you go and look, the projections were pretty right on as it got closer. That's always a challenge. There's such that variation when they have that cone of uncertainty, I think is what they call it. It could go, but they were pretty right on with the way it hit in. The good news was it wasn't as direct a hit on New Orleans, but because it happened west of New Orleans, they were on the east side, which got more of the rain and things of that nature. So we've gotten better, and that's why when you get into looking through your text, they talk about the key behind emergency preparedness, emergency management, is always continuous improvement. And it's a delicate balance because you want to learn from what happened yesterday. But you've also got to be able to anticipate what's going to happen tomorrow. Anybody here play football? Yeah. What are you, a running back? Yeah. So one of the things you have to deal with is you can't prepare for last week's game, right? You learn the lessons from it, but then you move it toward a new opponent, a new challenge. And emergency management's just the same. We have to learn from what happens, but then try to anticipate what's likely to happen next time. And so that analogy from sports always looked great. Yeah, you've got to learn from what happened, what you did right, what you did wrong, the history of the team, that's all in preparation. But once that is done, learn those lessons, then you look to the next opponent. And that's where you're going to be successful. Emergency management, emergency preparedness is basically that same methodology. And too often we get prepared to fight the last battle. We prepare to fight the last war, and we don't learn those lessons as much as we should. And just like disasters, we haven't learned as much as we possibly can, although as you'll see in this first 4 chapters, which will be the first exam, it's important to understand that we learn from history, but don't let it tie us down. And that's the important aspect here. How did the public respond? We talked a little bit about that. And most of the people got out when they could. When it got to be too late, it would be more dangerous to be on the road if it hit than being in your house. And it's always a challenge. I mean, several years ago, Atlanta had a big snowstorm, and they had all kinds of havoc on the roads. And so who got blamed for that? Why didn't you shut it down early? Why didn't you tell, right? But look at that. Some of you mentioned that as well. Government's in a tough position because they have to try to anticipate. Look in South Carolina when it's going to be a big snowstorm and everything shuts down and nothing happens. And then parents complain they had to get their kids out of school, blah, blah, blah. But if there's a big storm coming and they don't shut down, what happens? Pardon me? They complain that why didn't you shut it, right? And so government's kind of in a tough situation. Fortunately, our forecasting for hurricanes has gotten significantly better with satellites and modeling and stuff. But government, you win if you lose, and you lose if you win kind of thing, because people's always gonna fuss about something in the process.
One example, when I was living in Virginia, what they would always do is if they even suspected it happening, they would salt all the main roads.
Yeah.
Before it happened, and if it didn't happen, it was just whatever, but if it didn't happen, they basically made sure everyone can keep going.
And we salt the roads, and that's a good thing, because it melts the ice. What's the bad part about salting the roads?
It makes it water, so it's slippery still, but it's also like money, they're spending money doing it.
More fundamental than that. What happens to all that salty water that's the result of salting the roads? Where does it go?
Slide on your car.
On your car. Part of it's on your car, yeah. But it goes into the environment. It gets sucked into groundwater, stuff like that. So, I mean, it's good that we do that, but there are always downsides. And you look at what happens in large cities when there's a massive snowstorm. They get all the big plows and dumpers out, and they take it to an area, and they push it in the rivers. Well, they're going to pick up more than just snow when they go through and do the roads, right? In my area, they come by when it's pretty much melted because I'm so far out. But you can always hear them coming because you hear a thump, 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 thump. And that's where they're scraping off all these reflectors in the middle of the road. And then a few weeks later, somebody's back, putting them back in place, right? But those are the challenges. I mean, nothing's perfect, so you try to learn and anticipate, but you can't go from there. And the current status of your emergency efforts?
A lot of them kind of just stuck. They got to declare the city first.
Yeah, so the president's declared a disaster order, so that allows access to federal funds and federal resources for the area. And that's one of the issues that came up during Katrina, is there was pointing fingers, who didn't blame. The federal government can't do it on their own, they have to be requested by the state. And sometime within the states, it's a local municipality or county has to request the state do it. And so it goes through, but this was done early on, and the resources are there. And so when we go through this, we're going to go through the traditional 4 stages, and we're now in what they call the recovery, going back, doing search and rescue, trying to clear debris, things of that nature. It's kind of where we sat. They said they had 1, I heard this morning, possibly 2 deaths, but they anticipate more as they start clearing the buildings. And that was one of the strange things. I went down about a year after Katrina went through to help, as I mentioned, the colleague at the University of New Orleans, and driving through to see all the paint on the sides of buildings, what had been cleared, what hadn't been cleared, and the height of the water ring around the houses and stuff. It was just incredible to get by and do that. So Ida's there, we've got a couple more forming. We're now in the peak season for hurricanes, and so one hopes that we get prepared enough. And then you also see where most of the electric companies, utility companies have mutual aid agreements, where they'll send their trucks and crews to those areas to help restore. Which brings up one of the massive failures. We talked about post-Katrina, and one of the successes was the levee system it held. But what's the other system in the city that was spent a lot of money and failed completely? It starts with an E. Electricity, yeah. We got 1 million people without power. And all of the 8 grids coming into New Orleans failed. And the backup system they had didn't back up. So they're going to have to go look at back. A lot of the large transmission towers were knocked down. So they have to relearn those efforts, right, and make a difference. Stupid things that I've done, which is just me, is since I live in the country and get a lot of trees, my power lines going to my outbuildings are all underground. They didn't put the one coming into the house I have above ground, but the ones going to my outbuildings and stuff like that are all underground. Costs a little more money to get it done, but I don't have to worry about trees falling on it and knocking them out. And so there's an expense. So within emergency response and then recovery, there's all that expense. How much are we going to spend? Whose responsibility is that? And that's always a challenge as we go through. So the good news from there is they're relatively well prepared. The levee system, which is a major concern from New Orleans because it is below sea level, held up pretty well. Had very minimal flooding. Those outside areas that didn't have that got nailed. And the electric grid, which was supposed to have been reinforced, failed. So good news, bad news in the process. So we'll see how that works out. Anything else from Ida you want to chit chat a little bit about? Okay. Yeah. After 16 years, significant was spent, and the levee system we talked about, and the power grid. The levees held up well, the power grid not so well. And they were talking about could be weeks before people get their power back. One of the things, how many of you have a solar charger for your phone?
I do, just not.
Yeah, but you get what they're like, $40, $50, something like that for a decent one. Well, they're saying that nobody's got power, so they can't use the cell phones, so they can't charge them. Well, that seems like a relatively small investment, especially if you do a lot of camping and hiking and stuff like that, having a small solar charger. Okay, so move on from there. Now we go back to our text, and we're starting with the introduction and chapter 1, and we'll move on, finish 1 and 2 on this coming Thursday and the following Tuesday. One is this notion we already talked about. What's continuous improvement? Exactly, improving continuously. It's like I've said in all of my classes, a lot of these terms we use, just look at the words, it'll tell you what it means. You can try to look at it as a concept, it's tougher to do. But basically, what does that mean? Continuous improvement.
Constantly looking at how to make things better.
Yeah, constantly looking at how to do things better, what lessons can we learn? And again, the sports analogy, that's exactly what sports do, right? So that's the thing that when you get into political science and to this emergency management and all of these things that we deal with, is the concepts may be foreign, but underneath is basically what we do all the time in other settings. We just call it different things. Okay, so we always look for better ways to do things. What lessons learned? How can we improve these things? And one of the unfortunate facts of life is oftentimes we don't do anything until we're forced to do it, especially in the political environment because there's money involved. But in our own lives, how often do we defer maintenance on our vehicles?
Oh,
Right?
I don't like to do that. That stresses me out. Because I feel like it's going to break if I don't do it right.
Yeah, you know, I'm one of these fanatics. I take my cars to the dealership. You know, it costs more money, but I take it to the dealership. Because I live so far away, they give me a loaner vehicle to drive while it's in the shop. And you spend money on it, but, you know, it lasts.
It's better than if it breaks. You'll spend less money fixing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and plus with the dealer, you know, the dealership I has a 24-month warranty on all their work. So, but anyway, you know, we make these choices, and sometimes it's just, you know, do I pay the electric bill or do I get my prescriptions? I understand that aspect. But too much of what we do is we don't have a good preventive maintenance systems in place, and so we have problems that come about with that. What we've done, and we'll talk more about these, and your text talks about what's happened over the past basically 20 years, is the field of emergency management, emergency preparedness has grown up. And we now have more common definitions, which we'll get to, over what emergency management is, and we now have accepted principles of what emergency management is. And one of the big things that they talk about is management is not just technical expertise. Because there's some people that are great with it, you know, from a technical aspect, but they have poor management skills. And that was one of the challenges they had with FEMA when Katrina went through, is the person in charge of FEMA had no experience in emergency management, emergency preparedness. So what this recognizes is that good emergency management, good emergency preparedness, all requires not only technical expertise, but managerial ability as well. And that's an important aspect of it. And what are some of the impacts of social media on this whole issue of emergency response, emergency preparedness?
Gives people ease of access to information.
Better access to information.
Like yesterday, we were just like scrolling through it, whatever. We can see what's happening. You can see flood levels, you can see cameras, whatever.
Yep. Yeah, so social media made a big difference in letting people know what's going on, but also for people in the middle of it being able to reach out and contact. The phone lines may be down, but as long as their system is working, You know, with the satellites, you can do your Facebook and your Twitter and other kind of contacts. So, I mean, this growth of technology has been good news. One of the bad news in some of the studies I've read is people take the phones with them and they get involved in more risky behavior because they figure if they get in trouble, they can call somebody to come help them out. So kind of the good news, bad news about it. But that plays a big role, and we'll see that as well as we move forward with this. And there's several questions that are raised early on that we need to think about. Is emergency response, right, the responsibility of government?
Do you want an answer for that?
Hmm?
You want an answer?
Of course.
Okay, then definitely, because that's part of what we have in our Constitution is that we give up our rights for certain protections. And part of those protections should be extended to protections of our persons because we're giving up our rights to do that.
Nice try. I mean, you know, use some good stuff in there. But yeah, but there's nothing in the Constitution that talks about emergency response, emergency management.
Yeah, it's general protection, which you extend upon, you know.
Yeah, okay. So you can have a hard time taking from a documentary perspective that it's government's responsibility. Because you have to do a lot of reaching, right? And has anybody been to Charleston or other cities that have an old section of town? Have you gone through and seen those markers on the side of a lot of the houses for fire service? What was that all about?
I've never seen that.
You've never seen them?
See, I just don't.
Yeah, see them. You probably see them, just don't realize what they are. Back in the bad old days, they had fire services and fire departments which you paid for protection. And you would put this plaque on the outside of your house. And if there was a fire, the fire service would come in, and if you didn't have the plaque on the building, they didn't fight your fire.
Dang,
Huh?
that's terrible.
That's rough.
Why is that terrible?
I mean, I guess not. I mean, you should have been more prepared to
Hang
have
on a
it.
minute. Pardon me?
You should have been prepared to have it out there so that we at least knew. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's part of their job. I mean, your job is to put out fires. If you can tell that there's a fire, why not just do it?
What about cases in South Carolina where a fire truck shows up and the building is on fire is not within their service area? Should they fight the fire?
No, just like cops shouldn't be able to pull me over in the wrong jurisdiction either.
Well, then, how's that different? If I show up at a fire and it's not in my district, I just let it burn down. How is that different than not having a plaque on your house that says I'm paying for fire service?
It's not.
Because if they're
I
not.
mean, it's the right thing to do when you put out the fire if you see the fire, but
See, and that's the challenge,
you should
right?
be like held like accountable for it. Like it's not what you were like. I don't know. Like I don't think you should be held accountable if it's not part of what like your like jurisdiction. But I mean, I feel like if you're there and you have what's needed to do it, then just do it.
Wait a minute, you just said you shouldn't do it because it's not your
I
jurisdiction.
know, but I mean, like I don't
No.
know. I'm just a good person. I would help.
And then my response is, here's my attorney's card, we'll be in touch.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And that's some of the challenges, right? And so traditionally, it's not been government's responsibility. It's been the private sector. You see that with the Red Cross. You know, you see that with all these other volunteer organizations that jump in. And so, you know, we've gone through this transition period where it wasn't government, and now it is government. And based on the video we saw last time, well, government, yeah, may have an oversight responsibility, but they don't have the expertise to do it all. And so, you know, in this country, emergency response. Well, that goes back to the fundamental question, what's an emergency? How big does it have to be before government responds?
Life.
Is this a rhetorical question?
Pardon me?
Is it a rhetorical?
Oh, no, I want answers. Because I figure you guys have them. I don't.
Life threatening.
Life-threatening.
That's when they should get involved.
In terms of government, probably like a city starting to fail.
Potential to destruction of like property and infrastructure.
Other thoughts? All good ideas. What do you think? Sitting there quiet. What is a disaster? Okay? So if I have a rabid raccoon in my yard, is that a disaster?
No.
It's an emergency.
I thought we were going to say fires. Yeah.
It's an emergency.
Is that an emergency the government should come in and deal with?
There's a technical threat to life if they can handle it themselves.
But is it responsible to government? No.
Not
See, and
really.
that's the challenge.
It's not the government.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, right?
That's what
We all have in our mind what emergency response ought to be, and but then if we take it down to the specifics, it gets tougher to do. Right? And that's one of the challenges with it.
Technically, yeah, because you have animal control.
Pardon me?
Technically, yeah, because you have animal control.
We have animal control. And then there are those counties that when the council was asked about putting in animal control, they looked at the person and said, you got a gun, don't you? Right? And that's the challenge, isn't it? Because we all know the challenge that creates the health and safety of not having some kind of animal control in place. You know, not only from rabies, but packs, all that kind of stuff. But then how do we get government to respond and deal with that? And oftentimes it comes down to what? Money. What can we afford to do? How big is the risk to us? And to do pretty much, and we all do that in our own lives, we kind of do a risk assessments, the cost-benefit analysis. And that's why some communities are better prepared than others. They use different formulas. And the reality is we've gotten to the point where we believe it's government's responsibility because, especially in our system of government, you know, that's why we're supposed to have the national government. And that was a big debate during COVID over whose responsibility it was. You remember those discussions and debates? Yeah. Oh, it's local government's responsibility. The federal government shouldn't be involved. But wait a minute, I thought that's what the federal government was supposed to do. I thought that's why they had stockpiles. So, yes, but is the answer to these things, right? Tristan knows well about most of my question answers are yes, right? Because it gets to be a challenge. And so it's perception. And what we don't want this to do is I think most people would agree government has a role to play, but the government shouldn't replace individual responsibility. You know, so how many of you have a 72-hour supply package in case something bad happens? Water, canned foods, things of that nature to help you survive.
I got a box of random MREs.
Just for the record, the MREs have gotten a whole lot better in my day when we had them. You get the pork stuff, you have to scrape them. Oh, amazing. But yeah, the new stuff is much better. But how many of you have that stockpile of MREs or other kind of things that are available?
At my house.
Huh?
At my house, but not here.
Yeah. How many of you have a fire starter? You can start a fire if you didn't have matches.
I have a rock.
Huh?
I have a rock and
Have a walk.
a rock and a rock.
Oh, rocket, okay. But I mean, you know, it's just these stupid questions, right? But we don't think about those things until what? Hurricanes come and you better get ready. So they have a flock to the store and everything gets ripped off the shelves. Whereas if you've got stuff set aside, see, and that should be our responsibility, not the government's. Should the government have a role? Absolutely, but it should not substitute for personal responsibility. And that's a challenge as you always have these debates. This idea of being prepared to survive on your own for 72 hours. You have food, water, medications. When I need to replace a stove, I put a gas stove in rather than electric. So that if we lose electricity, I can still cook and keep things warm, right? But I've also got a camp stove that uses those bottles of
Propane,
pardon me?
like the propane ones?
Yep. Yep. You know, I've got lanterns, both the ones that are battery operated and the ones that are white gas, you know, Coleman lanterns to get by and do those things. Do I have to use them? As I mentioned before, I've got 2 generators, a big one and a little one, depending on need, right? And I'm not saying I'm anything special, but, you know, at what point do we think about these things and start doing our own preparedness for it? And that gets to be the challenge as we go forward. How do you think, or why do you think this has kind of shifted? Because your text talks about this a good bit. What do you think has shifted that's made government having to take a more active role, a more proactive role in the issue of emergency management, emergency response? The text has several examples of things.
Social media, the exposure of what's happening, and like publicization
What's another reason why you think it may have evolved so that government has a greater responsibility?
So maybe financials.
Yeah, finances. I mean, we pay taxes and legislators to support certain things. And so oftentimes they're the ones that have the resources available to do that. I mean, that $14 billion to redo the walls in New Orleans didn't come out of, just the people in New Orleans' pocket. Everybody helped pay for that. And as your text talks about, often, you all have the text, right? Okay. Because keep in mind, since we're doing 4 exams, it'll be a lot more stuff out of the text. And so my talking points are just that, talking points. But you should be prepared to go back and do the background for it. Okay. A lot of it gets to be economy of scale. Government's oftentimes the only organization large enough to do something like that, to mobilize that kind of effort. And one of the key parts is back to this last. How does this whole debate over the government's role, and we'll see when we do more of the history, the evolution of it, what does that video we saw last time suggest about government's role? And we've already mentioned that earlier today when we talked about Cajun Navy and Team Rubicon and Red Cross. The video we saw from FEMA, you guys talk about the future of emergency response, emergency preparedness. And you made a specific point about the role of government should evolve to be what? It starts with a C, followed by an O, followed by an L. Collaboration. That the government should kind of be a clearinghouse for all of these non-government organizations who have resources and technical skills that they're willing to volunteer to help respond. And again, Team Rubicon, Cajun Navy, Red Cross, a lot of church groups send teams out to help, right? That coordination between and among the utility providers. And so the video suggests, and what you'll see coming out of this book is a suggestion that, yeah, government has financial resources, but perhaps the more important role it can play is in coordinating the efforts of those units, of those organizations involved in emergency response. And again, I mentioned both the Cajun Navy and Team Rubicon have one of their members embedded with emergency management in the area to have that coordination. So we've had this evolution where it was you do it on your own, then gradually government got more involved because of the size of the disasters and the emergencies taking place, and now they're realizing that government doesn't have all the answers, that we have to rely on a collaborative effort. So if you ask a question about kind of the evolution of the emergency response, emergency management, we do it on our own and through a series of events that we'll talk about some, and your book talks about several others, this notion that government stepped in. And then after that, this moved toward collaboration, meaning it gets to be more important. The traditional stages, and we'll talk about some of these kind of in an ancillary way, but they're important to know. The traditional stages of emergency management, emergency preparedness are mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. Okay, so what's mitigation? What does it mean to mitigate something? Yeah, so what steps can we take to make things less damaging? And so one of the most common forms of mitigation that you see are building codes. The public doesn't think about it in those ways, but the whole purpose of building codes is to help your building survive potential issues and disasters that come up. So they have all these hurricane straps. They have all these other things that are involved. How high off the ground you need to be, especially if you're in a floodplain. So they have all these things that are mitigation that have become a personal responsibility when you build to make sure that you have certain ground fault interrupt fuses or outlets in areas where it's likely to be water, where you have ways to control water supply, things of that nature, and all that's mitigation. From a larger scale, you could suggest that the reworking of all of the levees in New Orleans was a form of mitigation. It was done for the hopes of what? It would prevent the serious damage that they had before. Putting in storm windows, putting in all these other kinds of things that help minimize the impact of a potential disaster. That's what mitigation is about. And I always use, and one of the problems with that is I use this example quite frequently. How many fires does the best fire service in the country put out every year? None. And why would I suggest that? Pardon me?
They're like the best at that. But they do well at preventing.
Yeah, they spend a lot of time doing fire prevention, right? Going through and doing inspections, making sure systems are in place, making sure people have trained and things of that nature, right? So if they're really good at their prevention aspect, then you're going to have minimal fires. But how do they get funded? Based on the number of fires, right? Based on the responses, all that kind of. So the whole process from a political point of view is sometimes the very things we count to give you funding, because how do you count and give credit for a fire that doesn't start? Right? And that's one of the challenges of all of these efforts, is paying for things that are preventative in nature, where you can't go back and show specifically that that's what caused the reduction in the number of fires. So this whole idea of mitigation. That's early on when there's no impending disaster that you're aware of, that you can put things in place to help make it easier. And so again, building codes are one of the best, because that's what a lot of them are designed to do. Preparation. Where might preparation come into play?
It's like when you were talking about with FEMA, as they were preparing, they put their people inside the FEMA headquarters, so they had that communication so that they could coordinate.
Okay. What's another way that preparation might be different than mitigation?
I guess after the actual disaster, how you can prepare for the, prepare for, I guess, people who get displaced.
Okay. That would be under the recovery and the mitigation aspect.
When you run out of time to, like, when you, essentially you've done all the mitigation that you can, you have to start preparing.
I guess next. As a general rule, this preparation, yeah. I saw a hand.
I'd say preparation would include making sure all plans you have in place would work. So testing them out, making sure if there's, testing out your EAPs basically.
Yeah, all that's involved in preparation, and unfortunately, generally, if the citizens don't start preparing until when an emergency is announced. There's a hurricane coming, then they rush to the store. There's a snowstorm coming, then they rush to the store. So there are two different aspects of it. Government does the mitigation, and then they start looking at preparation. What plans do we have in place? And testing those plans, right, to make sure that they're successful. And we think they'll work when it comes to time to implement them actively. But for the average citizen, preparation starts when the disaster is announced. So that's getting everything ready, getting everything, pre-positioning everything ready to go. Okay? What is response?
Like a reaction.
Yes, reaction. So the first two are before an event happens, getting ready for it. And then the first thing you have is this response. How do we deal with it? What things do we have in place to deal with the impact of that emergency, that disaster? What teams do we have mobilized to move in? What resources do we have available that can move in, and how quickly we can move in to deal with those things?
Doesn't the Coast Guard normally help with
Pardon me?
response? Doesn't the Coast Guard help with response?
Oh, Coast Guard does a lot, yeah. The Coast Guard, by definition, is responsible for ocean and water things. So, and during Katrina, they did massive amounts of work.
They're there right now for Ida too.
Yep, there are a lot of them coming down. There was actually a piece on the news of the helicopter squadrons and preparing to go out and do those things. Yeah, some of those guys involved in emergency response, I mean, Coast Guard rescue swimmers and stuff like that, those people are bonkers. I take showers because I don't like sitting in water. So, sorry. So response is that immediately the disasters happened, and now let's get things back as best we can. And then what's recovery? Huh? Recovery, absolutely. Okay, we've had the disaster, we've responded to it, and minimized loss of life and stuff like that. We've got the major stuff cleaned up and out of the way, so now we can go back to recovery, rebuilding. So it's a cyclical nature. This is a traditional view, and we'll refer to these periodically, but I just want to make sure you have the terminology down. So it's a cyclical nature, like most things. And so as soon as you have recovery, then part of recovery is, well, what kind of mitigation things can we put in place to prevent it next time? Something's come along, let's get prepared, make sure we got the stuff ready. Then we have the response. We learn lessons from that, and it's very cyclical in nature. That's kind of the traditional view of how these things work as we move forward. Make sense? Okay. For these first 4 chapters, your author suggests that these are the 3 pillars, as he calls them, that are needed to be able to understand the evolution of emergency management, emergency preparedness, specifically in the United States, but internationally as well. Okay, and he talks about the importance of history. Why is history important?
You learn from history. So if it's like a similar event,
Yep.
you can kind of base it off of what you guys did then and how to improve on it.
Yeah. So history is a great teacher if we pay attention to it, right? And so understanding history is important. That's why this first chapter is there. First 2 chapters actually talk about the importance of history. What is social science research? Why might that be important? It is one of the pillars of emergency management, emergency response.
It's not just like kind of like how people would react.
And one of the long-lasting effects of the COVID-19 is going to be the impact on socialization of young children, the education. And some will be positive to the extent that people understood the importance of family and spending more family time together and whatnot. But there are also the devastating effects of people who lost jobs, the impact on people who were essential employees who didn't have the luxury of working from home or staying out of the throat. If you've been following the impact on healthcare providers, you can only put up with people dying on you every day for so long until it starts wearing on you. So understanding the social science research gets to be important. And then the other is technical expertise.
How to operate.
Yeah, how to operate. We know stuff. So those are the 3 pillars that he's talking about in this text. That'll be the first group. And again, this is a quote from the first start of the first chapter, and I've shown this before. What experience and history teaches us is that people in government have never learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. And part of what they're talking about there is the fact that a lot of people have short-term memories. They get all fired up to respond, and then things get back to pretty much a sense of normal, and so you forget about it. Does that happen? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's what they're cautioning here, and the cautionary tale is that what we should be doing is making sure we learn from these events, not relive them. And history is a good way studying gets to be important to do that. And he mentions, and again, a good test question, he mentions reasons why we should study history. And the reasons he talks about it being important is it talks about what could happen. If it's happened before, it's likely to happen again. So what could happen? It helps us in our way of preparing for future disasters. And that's one of the things that you'll be working on in your groups, and is designing a disaster preparedness plan for an organization. And we'll talk more about that next Tuesday. Identify foreseeable hazards. What does that mean?
Kind of prediction.
Yeah.
Pardon? Pardon me? Tristan?
Happened before it.
Yeah, I mean, what's foreseeable to a hazard? And so, like when you walk through your house, you see a roller skate in the middle of the living room. That's a potential hazard you may want to do something about, right? Your kid or your nieces or nephews or whoever leaves a toy right by the door leading into your bedroom, right? From a government point of view and from a larger, based on history, what's likely to happen? And how can we prepare early on for that? Gives you a long-range view, and what they mean by that is that because they happen historically, you can see how the recovery's gone. How did it come back? There's still lots of folks never returned to New Orleans after Katrina. So the impact on that movement of people away from the city. So you can see the long-term impacts. See the long-term impacts on the environment, on society, when you've got that historical perspective. The social impacts, and again, how has the disruption been to communities? What happens if in a low-income area, the few stores that are there got destroyed and the owners decided not to rebuild? And the term you may hear a good bit of today is talking about food deserts. Heard of a food desert? Yeah? No? Maybe? No? What's a food desert?
It's where you basically just can't go to the grocery store and buy stuff. You have to go like maybe like another city or two
Yep.
away.
Yep. It's this notion where you have no easy access to nutrition. And what happens is a lot of folks things that are in these areas are the little mom and pop stores that sell what? Ice cream, candy, soft drinks. Not necessarily the most healthy food in the world to do that. Cascading events. What do we mean by cascading events?
So they have just like a waterfall, like a domino effect.
The domino effect is a good way. Another way to put that is that if this happens, what's likely to happen that we didn't think about? And when that happens, what happens? So it says cascading. So the waterfall is a great example. Things just kind of accumulate over time that one thing causes another thing causes another thing. And because we have historical records, we can anticipate those things and build in. And then the term that your text uses, this thing called focusing events. But what it really means is, let's look at this and find out if the reason all this happens is we have lousy policy. It puts all our attention on things. And so focusing events, are major events that happen in your lifetime. So for me, focusing events would be the assassination of John Kennedy, the World Trade Towers, Hurricane Hugo, and for a lot of you, that's ancient history, right? Most of you weren't around when Hugo went through. Some of you may not have even been around when 9/11 happened, because we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of that. But what are some of the focusing events during your lifetime?
For disaster, I guess you could say like FEMA trailer.
Why is that? Why do you focus on that? Why is that a major thing for you?
Why I just brought it up.
Okay. Yeah, but what are we going through right now? COVID. That'll be a focusing event for you in your lifetime. You remember where you were and what was going on with COVID, how it affected your life, right? If you lived in New Orleans, Ida would be a focusing event. So these major things that happen. And they're going to be different for everybody, but generally they're these large-scale events that they're of such significance that you remember where you were when it happened. You know? I remember the spring of 2021 football season when we went 5-1. And most of our players are back, so there's a lot of pressure. I got season tickets, so I want you guys to be good. Right? No, but there are things that happen like that, right? And we all have those at different stages. But that's the importance, and your text goes into a lot more detail. And what's the good thing to say about this? You'll have an opportunity to demonstrate your understanding of why it's important to study history as you go through. First, emergency manager. Text talks about. Okay, let me give you a clue. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark?
2.
No, he took none.
Moses had none, it was Noah.
Okay, good. So yeah, you caught yourself, yeah. Good recovery. Like the first reference to baseball in the Bible is in the book of Genesis. It starts out, in the big inning. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. But they said Noah was the first emergency manager because he had knowledge of something coming. He took action to deal with it. And then when they were done, they recovered from what happened. But now the trivia question, what do CE and BCE mean?
Before Christ.
No.
Current,
Before Christ existed.
Nope.
current
Christ
era,
existed.
is it current era before current era?
And what happened is they got away from the Julian calendar references to AD.
Why? That was so much easier.
It's the reason is I don't want to get into that, but now you'll see these expressions, CE, which means current era, which basically starts at year 0. And BCE is anything that happened before. It's the same principle, but rather than having a religious connotation, although it was from the Julian calendar.
Yeah.
How many of you, when you read, have a dictionary close by? Good job, yeah. I to this day, whenever I'm reading, I'll have my phone or something close by, because my dad used to use big words all the time.
Yeah.
So looking up. And oftentimes when we're reading, we miss the point because we don't take those few seconds to look up a word. I don't know it, so I just let it go by.
I like to guess what it means.
Yeah, a lot of folks do that on the exam.
Yeah, that is true.
They guess what that means. The average unabridged dictionary has roughly 500,000 words. You know what the average vocabulary of a college graduate is?
6.
It's a little low, but close. About 10,000 words. And if you don't believe it, next time you're doing an essay or report, do a word count. It'll show you how many unique words you use. It's scary what we use all the time. So Noah, this is a good little question to come up, and why? Because he knew of a disaster and prepared. Whether it's true or not, your text goes into great lengths to talk about is not necessarily the point, but stories such as that make sense as we go forward. Pliny the Elder. How many of you have done a lot of reading of Pliny the Elder? Yeah, good answer. What your text talks about is a lot of historical things that comes from these early writers. He was a Roman writer, naturalist, and he wrote a lot of description about Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius and the impact. One thing that was interesting, 62 BCE, and the energy was about 100,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped at Hiroshima. And if you've seen any of the videos and stuff, they've done a magnificent job restoring the old city of Pompeii. And one of the things that's amazing is they have the casts of people that died who were covered in ash, showing them the locations they were. Right? But the reason we know about that is because Pliny the Elder wrote a great description of what happened and the impacts that it had. So when I first started graduate school, I wanted to be a prehistory major because I figured there'd be less reading. Think about that's pretty funny because prehistory there wasn't nothing there. You got to explain it, it loses something, okay? But Pliny the Elder, so Mount Vesuvius and the explosion of the volcano, and we had that here in this country some years ago, right?
Yes.
Mount St. Helens and the impacts and stuff. So these things recur, and we can learn something, is what your text suggests that we need to do. And some of the quotes I thought were interesting. Again, just trivia time. You've heard the home is where the heart is? That was Pliny the Elder. Came up with that. The only certainty is that nothing is certain. And in vino veritas.
That's Latin.
Yeah. Good job. What does it mean?
Something about life.
No.
Something about
Wine.
Wine.
yeah.
In wine, there's truth.
Happiness.
Veritas. What's one of our words that we use that may have its root in veritas? That has to do with this idea of truth. Verify. Right? That evolution of words and vocabulary as we go through. And Emperor Augustus in 6 CE, in response to fires, created these things called vigiles, which some suggest is the root of the word vigilantes. But they were designed and they had them spread throughout the city to be night watchmen, to be on the lookout for fires, to take action. So that was very organized, and your text makes the point. It's amazing. The way that was set up and structured is very similar to the way a lot of fire services are organized today. You have people, they're distributed among sites, all those things. It's also called this last cohorts of vigilum, but that's just another added point. But the thing in your text only calls it vigiles, V-I-G-I-L-A-S. And that was Emperor Augustus for his firefighting that came through. Pandemics, and we'll kind of end on these, the Black Death, the plague, bubonic plague. Europe and Africa, within 25 to 50% of fatalities in the first 3 years. And estimates are anywhere between 75 and 200 million people died from the bubonic plague. Yeah, massive, and you've seen stories and stuff about that. And then the one you may have been most current with is the Spanish flu, which is a variation of H1N1, 1918, and killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide. So we have experience. And so out of those experience, your books talks about, we learn about quarantining, and mass graves and all these other kind of things that we're still doing today to deal in response to some of these things. And there's a lot more detail in your text. And then currently today we're dealing with SARS, which is 2003, which is, avian bird flu and things of that nature, another pandemic. And now we're in the middle of COVID-19, which is occurring. So these things happen. We know they're going to happen. It's just the nature of nature. Things evolve, things change, and as much as we think we know, what we should realize is how little we know, because Mother Nature is full of surprises. Questions, comments? Makes sense what we've done. And again, we're doing this groundwork, so looking at Ida coming through is kind of a good real-life idea of how things work and what works and what doesn't work. And over the next few weeks, you'll see how this recovery effort takes place as we go forward to move these things. And then the importance of looking at history. We can learn from history. And always learn from it, take the lessons away, and don't tire of them over time, because they're always going to be there. Okay. So Thursday, we'll be finishing up on Chapter 1, starting on Chapter 2. And as I say, this video will be posted tonight. I have to go and convert them to an MP4 in order to upload them. And I'll send you an email. Did that help last time? Send you an email to let you know it was posted. Okay, I'll send another email to let you know you're posted. And again, where these come in handy is I don't do study guides, but you can see what I emphasize during the class, and you'll see my little hints about the ability to demonstrate knowledge. Those are the things to pay attention to as you move forward. If nothing else, have a great day, and we'll talk soon.